Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney. Today, we're going to talk about some really interesting Hebrew language insights from Habakkuk chapter 2. This is the chapter that has some of the most famous verses in the entire Hebrew Bible, such as write the vision and make it plain on tablets so that he may run who reads it. Or verses like the just shall live by faith, plus a lot more that maybe we're not familiar with. And in this episode, my goal is to share Hebrew language insights, and I do not have experts in mind. So, whatever your level of Hebrew is, whether you've done quite a bit or you've done none at all, my goal is to share this in such a way where everyone will understand and benefit. Because reading the Bible in Hebrew is one of my favorite things to do. And I think it's really interesting. It's so engaging. And there are also insights difficult to see in English translations. So I have chapters in the description below so that way you can jump to whatever is most interesting or skip things that you're not interested in today's content. The first thing I want to talk about is where Habakkuk chapter 2 begins, because unfortunately, I think the chapter division for this place is not in a good location. So let's look at the text of Habakkuk chapter 1 and 2 briefly in a big picture sense and talk about why I think this location is unhelpful. So remember that chapter divisions are a very late invention on dividing the text of the Hebrew Bible, especially so with subheadings that some of your Bibles may have. And the way that Habakkuk is broadly structured, you could say, is that verse 1 through 11 begins with Habakkuk's first line of argumentation against the Lord. It really begins with a question that he has. And this is a really unique way to begin a book. If you're interested in learning more about Habakkuk chapter 1, I did a video breaking down Hebrew language insights from Habakkuk chapter 1 that you can see earlier in one of the earlier recorded podcasts or one of the earlier videos on YouTube. And Habakkuk 1 through verse 4 is Habakkuk verbalizing his complaint, verbalizing what doesn't make sense to him. And then verse 5 is when God responds. And God gives a response that Habakkuk's not happy with. Habakkuk's original complaint is that there's injustice in the land of Judah. And there's violence, there's wrong, there's evil happening. How can you look at this? God's response is, I'm raising the Babylonians. I'm raising up an empire who's going to come and going to take this land, and they're going to exile this land. And we learned that Judah, the southern tribes, the remnant of the land of Israel, they are becoming the new Canaanites in a way. And the Babylonians, this empire is becoming like the new Israel, in that the Canaanites were dispossessed of the land once their iniquity was fulfilled or was fulfilled, and Israel came in, inherited that land, and now it's being reversed. So it's a crazy reversal happening here. And God goes on to describe how powerful this Babylonian army is that's coming in. But this also doesn't make sense to Habakkuk either. This is one of those times where the answer to the question we had, the burgeoning question, the answer is even worse than the original dynamic we were dealing with. And so Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 12 through chapter 2, verse 1 is all of Habakkuk's second line of argumentation and complaint against the Lord. And then Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2 is when God begins his second response. So the way that this should really be structured, in my opinion, is chapter 2 should be, if you're going to do chapters, chapter 2, I think, should begin at Habakkuk 1, verse 12. So that way, Habakkuk chapter 1 is verses 1 through 11, Habakkuk's first complaint, God's first response. And then Habakkuk chapter 2 would begin in chapter 1, verse 12, all the way through the end of verse 2. So it would get Habakkuk's second complaint and God's first response. So let's just go ahead and read the text of Habakkuk, the second line of argumentation from Habakkuk and God's second response. And I want to read the Hebrew so that way you can just hear what the language sounds like. I use a modern Hebrew pronunciation. Some of you might use a different pronunciation system or taught a different one. There are multiple theories about how biblical Hebrew was pronounced historically in different eras and in different regions of the land of ancient Canaan. But I have used modern Hebrew pronunciation because learned modern Hebrew first, and there are many people today who use that when engaging with biblical Hebrew. So I'm going to read this line by line. And to make sure we're following along and understanding what's happening, I'm going to read from the translation in front of me, which I have the ESV. And after I'm done translating, we'll dive into some specific insights. So let's go ahead and read Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12 through the end of chapter 2 in Hebrew and English. Halo ata mikedem Adonai, Elohai kadoshi, lo namut. Adonai lemishpat samto, v'tzur leochiach yesadto. Are you not from everlasting? O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. Tohor einaim mera'ot ra, v'habit el amal lo tuchal. Lama tabit bogdim, tacharish bevala rasha tzadik mimenu. You who are of pure eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors, and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Vata'aseh adam kidgei hayam, keremesh lo moshel bo. You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. Kulo bechaka he'ala, yigorehu v'chermo. V'yasfehu b'michmarto, al ken yismach v'yagil. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Al ken yezabeach lechermo, v'kater lemichmarto, ki vahema shamen chelko, uma'achalo bri'ah. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Ha'al ken yarik chermo, v'tamid laharog goyim lo yachmol? Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Al mishmarti e'emoda, v'et yatzva al matzor, v'atzape lirot ma yedaber bi, Uma ashiv al tochachti. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Now we're in chapter 2, verse 2, and this is where God's response begins. And I'm going to read through the rest of chapter 2. Vayaneni Adonai, vayomer, ketov chazon, uva'er al haluchot, leman yarutz korevo. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. Ki od chazon lamoed, v'yafeach laketz, v'lo yechazev, im yit mahama chake lo, ki vo yavo lo yacher. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Hine upla lo yashra nafshabo, v'tzadik be'emunato yichye. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not right within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. V'af ki hayayin boged, gever yahir v'lo yinve, asher hirchiv ki sheol nafsho, v'hu chamavet v'lo yispa. V'yesof elav kol hagoyim, v'yikbotz elav kol ha'amim. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Halo ele chulam alav mashal yisau umelitza chidot lo? Vayomar, hoi hamarbe lo, ad matai umachbid alav avtit. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own? For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Halo feta yakumu noshchecha, v'yiktu miza'azecha, v'ayita li mishisot lamo? Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them. Ki ata shalota goim rabim, yishalucha kol yeter amim, midmei adam v'chamas eretz, kirya v'chol yoshveva. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Hoi botzea bet zara leveto, lasum b'marom kino, lehinatzel mikaf ra. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. Ya'atzta boshet levetecha, ketzot amim rabim v'chotei nafshecha. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. Ki even mikir tizak, v'chafis me'etz ya'anena. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Hoi bonei ir bedamim, v'chonen kirya be'avla. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Halo hine me'et Adonai tzvaot, v'yig'u amim b'dei esh, ule'umim b'dei rik yi'afu. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? Ki timale haaretz ladat et kvod Adonai, kamaim yechasu al yam. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Hoi mashke re'ehu, misapeach chamatcha v'af shaker, leman habit al me'orehem. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. Savata kalon mikavod, shte gam ata v'he'arel, tisov alecha, kos yamin Adonai, v'kikalon al kvodecha. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Ki chamas Levanon yichasecha, v'shod behemot yichitan midmei adam, v'chamas eretz, kirya v'chol yoshveva. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Maho'il pesel, ki fisalo yotzro, masecha umore shaker, ki vatach yotzer yitzro alav, lasot elilim ilmim. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Hoi omer laetz hakitza, uri le'even dumam, hu yore, hinehu, tafus zahav v'chesef, v'chol ruach ein bekirbo. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. Vadonai behechal kodsho, has mi panav kol haaretz. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So that's Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12 to the end of chapter 2 in Hebrew, and I read from the ESV. As always with these Hebrew language insights videos, there is so much that I could cover, so much that I can do. And at least in this time, I don't make my own unique translation. That's a whole nother craft to try to do really well, and very difficult. So I am going to point out some interesting Hebrew language insights that I see. And if there's anything that you notice in the text as we read, feel free to jump in the comments section below. Also, if you enjoy just reading the Hebrew Bible in a group, we would love to have you join our Hebrew Bible book club, where we do a live stream every month with me and also often Dr. Nathan French. And we just open up a text of the Hebrew Bible. We read together, and you guys can read along with us and comment through text in the live stream, and we can kind of just go back and forth discussing what we see in the text because there's something beautiful about getting into communities and reading the Bible together. So, the first Hebrew language insight that I want to point out is actually from the very first line of Habakkuk's second line of argumentation and response, where he says, Halo ata mikedem Adonai, Elohai kadoshi lo namut. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. Um, Notice that Habakkuk begins with a question again. This is kind of his thing, that he starts the book uniquely by speaking his own words, not the words of God or the words of a vision of God, but he speaks his own words. And what are his words? It begins with a question. And this time, he refers to the eternal nature of God. So there's something really interesting in this line that if you go with a rabbinic tradition, then it shifts the focus of this line as opposed to if you go with what we have in the manuscripts. Um, so this line here, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. So the line that's in contention is we shall not die. So this line in Hebrew, as well as in the old translations, more or less all read something about we shall not die. Now, it just so happens that this is one of about 18 instances of a rabbinic tradition called Tikkune Sofrim, and which roughly translates to something about the edits or corrections of the scribes. And there are a lot of, you could say, tikkunim, perhaps, if you want. There's a lot of tikkun that we see in the Hebrew Bible manuscripts. If you ever looked at medieval manuscripts like the Leningrad Codex, the Sassoon Codex, the Aleppo Codex, and so on, they don't just present the Hebrew text, they list a lot of notes on the sides. And some of them are even notes where they think, hey, what's written here, what we've received, it needs a little bit of an edit because there was a scribal error at maybe some point in the past. And most of these are very inconsequential. Sometimes it's just a matter of spelling, whether the letter yod is supposed to be in this word or not. But sometimes it produces a totally different word than what's in the text. So if you're using a study Bible, for example, you might notice in the bottom that they might make a note on certain translation lines. The ones that are only about spelling, you won't notice, but some that could impact translation, they'll make little notes. For example, you'll have some manuscripts say, generally that's referring to old translations, like old Greek translations. Um, it could refer to the Dead Sea Scrolls, what it has to say. But I'd be curious if any of your study Bibles mention a very unique category called Tikkune Sofrim. What makes these unique is this tradition can go as early as the first and second century AD or CE, where there are certain texts called the Tanhuma or Mechilta or some other really early Jewish sources that say there are certain instances where, according to the tradition, at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, certain texts were intentionally changed for euphemism and were maintained that way throughout the centuries, even though the initial writing was something different. And so these instances are theoretically always done to protect some form of an awkward reading that might happen. And so we have one that's here. And according to this tradition, how this line would have been read is not we shall not die, but you shall not die, is what the original reading was. So, what would be the difference in Hebrew if that were the case? Instead of it being lo namut, it would be lo tamut. So it's just changing that first letter in the verb for die, because in Hebrew the word we is inside, and as well as the word shall. So we shall die. That's one word in Hebrew, and it's the right before it comes the word lo, which means no or not. So it'd just be changing one letter. And according to this tradition, what's the big deal? Well, because the phrase says, lo namut, we shall not die. But if it says lo tamut, it would read, um, you will not die. But what you still have is why would there ever be any phrase, even though it's a rhetorical question, Why would it be asked that God could die? Like, why even bring that up? Especially when the very next Hebrew word, even though it's divided by this atanach, this major um, division, disjunctive mark, you would have the word tamut right next to Adonai. And so for the Jewish tradition, there are a couple problems that they would see with that. And so now let's say it originally did read as lo tamut. What's the implication? This would read, "Are you not from everlasting? O Lord my God, my Holy One, you shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for a proof." The feeling that this passage would have is Habakkuk is questioning God yet again, and he's appealing to how eternal God is and saying, "You're not going to die. You are forever, but you've established these people as judgment against us. You're humans, mere mortals." It would give off the tone that Habakkuk sees a lot of um, difficulty navigating this current situation that he's in. So, if you want to read someone who does go with this translation and this tradition, Robert Alter would be the most famous person, I would say, who takes this on. If you haven't heard of Robert Alter, he's written one of the best translations of the Hebrew Bible. He is a premier expert in literature and translation and Hebrew. He's done phenomenal work on narrative and poetry in the Bible, as well as his famous translation with notes. So, if you happen to have that copy, you can see he translates it with "You shall not die," and he gives his explanation below about the Tikkun Sofrim and how he thinks it makes sense given the context. Now, most translations are not going to choose that. In fact, if you look at BHQ, which is Biblia Hebraica Quinta, that is like the standard text critical presentation of the Hebrew Bible that presents the text of the Leningrad Codex, along with all the scribal notes. But also, what it has is a text critical apparatus that compares all the relevant manuscripts of the text. And when you compare this line to the Old Greek Septuagint or to things like the Targums, the Peshitta, the Latin Vulgate, and so on, and given everything in consideration, the editor for the BHQ volume of the Minor Prophets decidedly sides with how the Masoretic text and the other ancient translations read, that it should really still be "we shall not die." And they don't go with this later rabbinic tradition that theoretically has an older root in it. So, if the text really is indeed as it's translated here in the ESV and as it reads in the Masoretic text, what's the nuance here? Why is this interesting? Well, as much as Habakkuk is bringing a line of questioning to God, Habakkuk is still a prophet and he's still a man of faith. And we can see that through a couple ways. One, and firstly, is that Habakkuk, although wrestling with difficult things in the world, he still brings it before God. We see that in Habakkuk 1, verse 2 and 1, verse 12, where he brings his questions to God, even though it doesn't make sense. Well, another layer we would see that, though, is in the first sentence of his second line of reason of argumentation. He does ask a question before the Lord, but he recognizes and acknowledges some of the core principles about how God works throughout the history of the Hebrew people. We'll bring this up a lot more later when we talk about Genesis and the flood later in this episode. It'll stand out even more then. But one of the themes we see is that there are times when God judges a people group, and that can be, maybe the Canaanites are dispossessed of their land, the exile for the people of Israel, the flood for the world. There are a variety of ways where God might judge an individual or a community or a large nation. But there's a remnant that's preserved, like in the flood story, how Noah and his family are a remnant that are preserved, and that remnant then goes on to continue God's plot and plan for the future. Even though there's an exile, there's a faithful remnant that is preserved that are able to stay in the land, and later others get to return to the land and continue the plot of what God's trying to do. So if Habakkuk says, "We shall not die," it's his way of, for a moment, saying, God, I recognize that you are judging us. And he's about to make it very clear he still doesn't understand this judgment. But even if that's the case, he knows we shall not die. Because you, O Lord, are you not from everlasting? O Lord, my God, my Holy One, saying you are of everlasting and you are our God. And we know that you continue to work through the years and we know how you operate. We shall not be We shall not die, as in we shall not be utterly destroyed, completely destroyed. So then he goes on to say, "O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for a proof." So this line can then be read more in a tone that Habakkuk understands what's happening. God isn't just willy nilly doing things because he feels like it. There's always intentional reasoning behind it. And so what he's saying is, you've ordained them, i.e., Babylon, as a, which the word them, technically in Hebrew, it's a singular, sum to, um, yisad to, which makes it the third masculine singular. You've ordained him, i.e., Babylon, as judgment against us. So he acknowledges this is how you're operating. This is what you're doing, which is totally in your purview. You're God. We're not. You're ruler. You're king. You're the one who has the power of ultimate divine retribution. And then in verse 13 is where we would still see what he has to say, though, which is, you are of pure eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up? And here's what's key, the man more righteous than he. So ultimately, Habakkuk's problem, again, is not that Judah, hey, he's not saying, hey, we're good, God. No, no. In Habakkuk, the first few verses of the chapter, he clearly talks about Judah. We have a problem, God. Help us become pure. Help us to get rid of this wickedness. But his problem now is, God, you're taking Babylon, who is more wicked than we are. We are more righteous than they are. How can you use them as the instrument to judge us? So what you're doing doesn't make sense. And so I think there could be something to model here. Um, from Habakkuk. Again, realizing that even when things don't make sense, there's something about just being honest and saying, I want to go before God with my questions, with my concerns. But there's a way to do that where we still acknowledge the character of God and who he is. So I think this is a text really worth reflecting on. Ultimately, what makes most sense to me is the way that the editors of BHQ, Biblia Hebraica Quinta, the way they evaluate it. I think based on the fact that all the old manuscripts, all the old translations, that is, side with "we will not die." I think that that's an abundance of evidence, and so yeah, theoretically, that Tikkun Sofrim tradition, if it goes all the way back to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, it'd be before these translations, and it was adopted in, so it's possible. I'd love to hear in the comments below. What do you think? Which rendering makes most sense to you? Which one is most interesting to you? And how do you think that that impacts the text? Whether it reads "You shall not die" versus "We shall not die." If you want to study more about the Tikkunei Sofrim in general, or just look at an extended analysis of this text of Habakkuk 1, verse 12, then I'm going to share an article with all of you by a scholar who wrote extensively on Tikkun Sofrim. She was also the scholar who did the BHQ volume of Deuteronomy. I know that doesn't feel relevant, but she's done a lot of excellent textual critical analysis. She unfortunately passed away just a couple of years ago, but I'm going to put a link to a lengthy article which actually I believed it was her published dissertation that she did, and that way you can read more if you'd like. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is take a look at Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. And as a reminder, show you how this is an unhelpful way to imagine the beginning of a chapter because it's the last words of Habakkuk's second line of argumentation and complaint. So there is a indention in the text, in the Masoretic text of the Leningrad Codex, where the manuscripts are based on. But that doesn't mean that this is necessarily a good place to begin a chapter, right? There are other reasons why they may or may not indent a text visually. Um, and so it's in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2, where God begins to respond. And there are a couple of interesting Hebrew language insights I want to show you here, because I know many of you, this is what you're most interested in. In Habakkuk chapter 2, we have famous verses about writing the vision and also about how the righteous shall live by faith. So we're just going to take some of these one at a time. And the first thing that I want to talk about is how there's some covenant language undertones to Habakkuk chapter 2 with what God has to say. When he talks about writing the vision and making it plain on tablets, this word for make it plain and this word for tablets both have very clear covenant connections. because the word for, to make it plain, this word only appears a few times in the entire Hebrew Bible. In fact, it only appears 3 times. And the other two instances appear in Deuteronomy 1:5 as well as Deuteronomy 27:8. And both of these verses have to do with the giving of the Torah, the explaining of the Torah to the people. Deuteronomy 1, verse 5 is the beginning of Moses' the second kind of giving of the Torah to a new generation. And Deuteronomy 27:8 is another instance where, um, as this new generation is about to be going in the promised land, it kind of gives them a rubric of some things they're supposed to do when they get there to kind of renew the covenant on a regular basis. So before we look at Deuteronomy 27, I also want to address the word tablets, luach or luchot. And this is also used in uh, the Bible to refer to writing things of the covenant on tablets. So we look at Deuteronomy 27, verses 1 through 8. Here's what it says. Now Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep the whole commandment that I command you today. And on the day you cross over the Jordan to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones and plaster them with plaster, and you shall write on them all the words of this law or of this Torah when you cross over to enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you. So this is the first instance where we see this idea of writing things on stone, the words of the Torah. And so there's already been the words of Torah written, but this is to play an important role in the continuing commitment of the covenant community to God, is that there are different times where the covenant is to be written down again and read and heard again, and to make sure people follow. And then verse 4, and when you've crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up 3 stones concerning which I command you today on Mount Ebal, and you shall plaster them with plaster. And there you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall wield no iron tool on them. You shall build an altar to the Lord your God of uncut stones, and you shall offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. And you shall sacrifice peace offerings, and you shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. And then finally, verse 8, and you shall write on the stones all the words of this law very plainly. In Hebrew, v'chatavta al ha'avanim et kol divrei haTorah hazot ba'er hetev. So again, this word for stone is not the word for tablet, but we see that word tablet in other places, like writing on tablets, the 10 words, or the also known as the 10 commandments. But you're going to write on the stones, the words of this Torah, ba'er, plainly, clearly. So when Habakkuk is speaking, and he's talking about writing on tablets and doing it plainly, this is eliciting covenant language from Exodus, especially Exodus through Deuteronomy. And um, and so it makes probably Habakkuk and his audience think about the idea that God is a covenant with these people. So there's a lot of directions we could go there with. I'd probably love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about what would it mean for the people, for Habakkuk the prophet and the people he gives this message to in a time period before exile, as well as people reflecting on this message during and after the exile. What does it mean that there's connections to the Torah, particularly Exodus through Deuteronomy, quite heavily? How might that impact this message? On a simpler level, though, too, note that the idea of writing something on a tablet, that's a much very enduring way and permanent way to write something down. And so it makes it a very sure thing what is coming. In fact, that transitions us well to another insight that I want to share from this, which is the word v'yafeach, which in the ESV, the way they translate this is hasten. Because what God goes on to say after writing on tablets and making it plain so that he may run who reads it, then says, Ki od chazon lamoed, for still the vision awaits its appointed time. Literally, for ki od, for still, chazon, vision, la is for a moed. A moed is an appointed time. And this is a word that's used in Genesis to talk about part of the purpose of the lights in the heavens is there to help people mark appointed and special times in Scripture. But then we have v'yafeach laketz, which um, this word is interesting. If we look at halot, which is a great lexicon of biblical Hebrew and Aramaic, this word could come from puach one, which is related to blowing and breathing, which then kind of can get extrapolated to a few other ideas, and that's where some theorize that this Habakkuk verse means, it hastens, as in it's blowing, and and so some things maybe like blowing as in panting, like it's panting to the end, and that it's moving quickly to the end. So it kind of gets abstracted that way. But I actually think a different option makes more sense that some other scholars have mentioned. It could be related to puach tu, which one places is attested in other Semitic languages like Ugaritic, which is a Semitic language very similar to Hebrew. Their root yafach means it's related to the word for witness, means witness. In fact, there are many times in the Hebrew Bible where this sense of the meaning happens. And depending on your translation, it may or may not be translated that way, but we see the word puach, this verb, used in the book of Proverbs. So there are a few different verses in the book of Proverbs that attest to the idea of this root as a verb referring to witness. Proverbs 6:19 is a false witness who breathes out lies and one who sows discord among brothers. Now, this ESV translation translates yafiach here as breathes, again related to the word for blow, saying that ed shaker, which means a witness of lies or a false witness, breathes out lies. But this could be that a false witness testifies lies. I think a really good example, though, to kind of show how this makes the most sense is Proverbs 12:17. Yafiach emunah yagid tzedek, ve'ed shkarim mirma. Whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. So in this verse here, yafiach in the ESV is being translated as whoever speaks, and then emunah being a word for truth. Yagid tzedek, he will declare or he will speak righteousness, okay, righteously. V'ed, but an ed, a witness, shkarim, but a witness of lies, deceit. There's no verb technically in the second unit. It picks up the verb from the previous one. So ultimately, what we have is yafiach is being used in parallel with an ed. And when we know that in Ugaritic, that yafach relates to a witness, and you have verses like this in the Bible, it makes a lot of sense that this can be a witness. So there's some other examples that you can look at in the Hebrew Bible. One more that I'm going to give is Proverbs 14:5, because it's important for ours. Ed emunim lo yechazev v'yafiach kzavim ed shaker, which is a faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness breathes out lies. But again, it can be just witness or testify. So it's especially important as we go back to Habakkuk, because you're going to notice that yafiach and kzavim, this word for lies or deceit, shows up again and again in Proverbs 14:5, 14:25, 19:5, and 19:9. Because when you look at Habakkuk, what's interesting is what's written is v'yafeach laketz, and it testifies of the end. V'lo yechazev, and it does not lie. So I think it makes a lot more sense given the context that there's a lot of covenant language going on here. And this is about something not lying, but something that testifies of the end. So I actually don't think that reading this as Puach 1 makes the most sense. Now, perhaps you could say, hey, this is about he may run who reads it. So Puach related to blow, and maybe abstracted to panting from going quickly. You have to make a couple steps, but maybe you see those as a stronger argument. For me, I think we have Yafeach, we have deceit and lying as something it is not doing. So, this being a faithful witness of the end of what's coming makes the most sense to me. But I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments below. Okay, so let's look at Habakkuk 2, verse 4. I wish I had time to break down all the things I see in this verse as well as this whole chapter, but I'm going to jump straight to, I think, the most important one where it says, "But the righteous shall live by his faith." And many people know this verse from how Paul quotes it, where he says, "The righteous shall live by faith." In Hebrew, what we have is be'emunato, by his faith. Um, but then if you read in the Greek Septuagint, it reads by my faith. A couple things. First, remember, it's good to know, actually, you may not know this, but the word for faith is also a word for faithfulness, trustworthiness. And so, what could this be referring to? That in the midst of things that aren't making sense, there's a vision that God has for his people and what he's going to do, what's happening. And the righteous person is going to do what? They're going to live by his faithfulness. So that could be, um, hey, you do your part, be faithful to the covenant. That's what you can do, right? Even amidst chaos that's happening around you, things aren't making sense. Continue to live in faith. So that's one rendering it could be. But if this is read according to like the Greek Septuagint translation, which theoretically could have just a different Hebrew behind it, which his versus my feels like a big difference. And in meaning, it could have a significant nuance, but in Hebrew, it'd be the difference of having a vav versus a yod is the only difference. Yod at the end of a word is my, whereas vav at the end of a word is his. And those letters are written very similarly. It's actually one of the most common scribal mistakes that we run into in Hebrew Bible text manuscripts. So it's not far fetched at all that maybe there's a different Hebrew text that reads "Be'emunati," by my faithfulness. And if that's how it's supposed to be read, then it's God saying, "Trust me. The righteous will live by my faithfulness." So again, in spite of what's coming, remember to put your trust in me. So that would speak a powerful message as well. Another interesting potential is reading it as not by his faithfulness, but by its faithfulness, because there's no word in Hebrew for it. Everything is gender. So it's either his or her, even if it's not referring to a person or something that's gendered like an animal. And so John Collins, for example, he reads this as, "But the righteous will live by its faithfulness." In other words, that being the vision. So trust the vision and what's coming. So, you know, the difference between trusting in God versus trusting in his vision, you could see at the end of the day, does that feel kind of slight? I don't know. But theoretically, you could have someone who trusts in God, but not in this new thing that God has spoken and said. You could have someone who maybe only trusts in a vision, but not in the one who gives the vision. So there's a lot you could preach on if you want about the difference between trusting in something God does, but then also trusting in God himself, trusting in something like trusting in God, but maybe not trusting in what he is doing or what he's saying. A lot you could break down in there. But there is reason to view this in a few different ways. Because obviously Paul, there's no possessive suffix at the end. The righteous will live by faithfulness or by faith. It's just no ending on there. That's almost kind of the most open-ended. It's like, whose faithfulness? Is it the righteous live by God's faithfulness, by my faithfulness, or is it maybe both, a mixture of both? And it's a two-way street in this relationship. So just a few different insights there. All right, the last thing that I want to show you all today is how there are a number of allusions to the flood story here. And it's very interesting. Habakkuk to me is someone who's very in tune and in touch with Israel's history. I'll go more into that in another episode, probably when I cover chapter 3. But we see Habakkuk makes a couple comments. It starts in verse 14. "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And that might not be enough to maybe connect to the flood story specifically, but once we read the next verse, it clearly is. "Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness." This is a clear allusion to the end of the flood story when, after everyone has exited the ark and Noah plants a vineyard and he drinks of the fruit of the vine and he gets drunk, and one of his sons does some kind of uh, something bad with him, probably some sort of sexual misconduct. Um, with his dad. We don't know exactly what's going on. The text it doesn't make it very clear. And his other two sons, though, come in backwards, not looking at their naked father, and cover him with a blanket. And then Noah ends up cursing the son who did something while he was drunk. And so there's a clear connection here that Habakkuk is tying into. And what's he trying to say? He goes on verse 16, you will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your circumcision. So that's pretty visceral interaction, right? Instead of you getting people drunk and having your way with them in an inappropriate sexual way, he's saying, you get drunk and then you reveal yourself and show everyone your uncircumcision. And again, connection to Hebrew covenant. That's part of being one of the covenant stipulations that they were supposed to do, and basically revealing, hey, you're going to show that you were never faithful to begin with, and you aren't faithful to the Lord. So who is he talking about in this context? He's talking about Babylon. This whole section, he's basically talking pretty much all exclusively about Babylon, what he's going to do. So when he responds to Habakkuk's line of argumentation, God does affirm saying, hey, ultimately, Babylon will fall because yes, they are a tool that I'm using for my instrument of judgment, but ultimately they will pay the consequences for the wickedness with which they are acting in the world. And um, but he's still saying the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters covers the sea. But it's still woe to Babylon, the one who is, doing a lot of bad things. But one of the ways he describes it is kind of like what one of Noah's sons did to him. A lot we could unpack here. I do recommend reading all of chapter 2, as I did earlier, and maybe thinking about this text. Maybe another time we can return, dive into some of the other details, because there's plenty of interesting things here. But I at least wanted you guys to know, if you hadn't seen it before, how clearly there is an allusion to the flood story. I'm going to leave you with one last insight that's maybe a cliffhanger, because we'll have to dive into this later. And this goes back to about writing the vision, making it plain, so that he may run, and make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. There's a big question, which is, what's the vision? And there are some scholars who believe the vision begins in verse 4. So right after he says, wait for the vision, here it comes. Verse 4 and following is the vision. But interestingly, John Collins actually posits the vision doesn't begin until chapter 3. So it's not that the words that follow, aren't connected to God by any means. That's not what he's saying, but that the vision proper isn't until chapter 3. There's an interesting reason for why he says that. So I'm going to leave you guys on that kind of cliffhanger. If you want to read chapter 3 ahead of time, go ahead, feel free. But I'm probably going to do an episode on some Hebrew language insights of Habakkuk chapter 3. As usual, there's so much I could dive into, and it's impossible to cover everything in just one conversation, but hopefully this adds value to you and in your life. Would love to have some of you in our Hebrew Bible book club on Patreon. Also, you can always like, subscribe, follow, and share our stuff with other people so we can help make sense of the Bible for others. Thanks for joining me for today's episode, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.